Chapter 10 is about the macroeconomic flow. Chapter 10 consists of 5 sections. The macroeconomy can be considered as the total of all economic behavior measured through the gross domestic product. The gross domestic product is this intersection of the aggregate supply curve in the economy and the aggregate demand curve. Key is the equation for aggregate demand, which we represent by AD or Y. It is C plus Y plus G minus T plus X minus M. C is consumption, I is investment, G is government expenditures, minus T is taxes, plus export minus imports. This chapter uses examples from Japan. The table shows you economic growth rates in Japan from 1980 till 2013. You will see there's quite some variation in the growth rates, more or less between minus 5% and plus 5% GDP growth. The most important macroeconomic function next to aggregate demand is the consumption function. C consists of autonomous consumption, that is what you buy anyway, whether you have an income or not, plus a share of your income. Y is your income, and small c is the propensity to consume, the share out of your income that you spend on consumption. All your income you spend either on consumption or you save. In other words, savings is your income minus what you spend on consumption. And savings, hence, is also a share out of your income, that's small s, the propensity to save. When we add up the propensity to consume and the propensity to save, we get 1. That is, together they're 100%. So if your propensity to consume is 60%, your propensity to save will be 40%. This is the key diagram for this chapter of the book. You will see variations depending on the theory later on in this presentation. The diagram is a circular flow diagram. It shows flows between households, governments and firms of money and of goods and services and labor. In social economics, we recognize the economic role of communities. This leads to a change in the circular flow diagram, namely in the household sector. We add to this explicitly unpaid work and a production of unpaid services. Remember, social economics is about the recognition that the economy is embedded in society and in our natural environment. So firms have to engage in a social contract with society to obtain their license to operate. Government is supported by political and social relationships, and a community economy provides unpaid work, both for households, for the communities themselves, and for nature and the natural environment. Here we have the embedded economic flow. You recognize in the middle the standard economic flow, but with an addition around the households, namely communities, where households make part of. Then you see a larger circle called society, in which the economy is embedded, and that society, furthermore, is embedded in nature. And we see services, labor, and products moving back and forth between households and communities on the one hand, and society and nature on the other hand. Macroeconomics, from an institutional perspective, looks at institutions such as taxation. This is important because taxation reduces people's income. So we have to calculate disposable income, which is the gross income minus taxes. This implies we need to adapt the consumption function. It's autonomous consumption plus the propensity to consume, but not out of your gross income, but out of your disposable income after taxes. And the higher the taxes, the lower your disposable income, and hence the lower your consumer expenditures. Unless, of course, you manage to increase your disposable income by taking out a credit. This slide shows you the adapted circular flow diagram from an institutional perspective. Taxation between government and household and government and firms. And there's the rest of the world, other countries. So we can add imports and exports. And we have to include informal institutions. Remember the unwritten rules, social norms, attitudes, beliefs. And they affect many things. Households, the way government operates, firms, and the relationship with the rest of the world. In post-Keynesian economics, we consider the economy to be an open system. That is because we cannot simply add up all individual bits and pieces of economic behavior. That's wrong. We call that the fallacy of composition. First, there is herd behavior, non-rational following of other behaviors. And there's the paradox of thrift, the virtue of saving at the individual level to counter uncertainty, and the vice of saving at the aggregate level. Because if everybody saves money for a rainy day, nobody's spending on consumption. So firms don't need much labor to produce goods, so there will be unemployment. This reduces aggregate demand. So post-Keynesian economists pay attention to uncertainty and the effects of uncertainty on people's behavior in the economy. In post-Keynesian economics, it's the demand side that matters much more than the supply side. Because the demand side determines to what extent the full capacity of the economy is used or not, and resources, including people, remain unemployed. What about savings, for example? Well, they're not determined by the interest rate, but by income, disposable income, and consumer expenditures, because simply the money you don't spend on consumption is the money you have available for saving. So we determine the size of S by subtracting C, consumption, from Y, income. And R, the interest rate, is not that relevant, only for a speculative motive. This is the post-Keynesian diagram for the macroeconomy. It shows you the point of effective demand. Don't get confused. This is not market equilibrium. As you see, there is not a downward sloping demand curve. The aggregate demand curve, just like the aggregate supply curve, are both upward sloping. What are the axes? That's important. The horizontal axis is N. That's the symbol economists use for employment. The vertical axis is Y. That's the gross domestic product, the total demand or the total supply in the economy. And where they meet, that's the intersection of the AS and the AD curve. That's the point of effective demand in the economy, which determines the size of employment. A little technical question. Why is the slope of aggregate demand less steep than the slope of aggregate supply? For every increase in income of a fixed amount, the employment effect at the demand side is larger than the employment effect at the supply side. Because at the demand side we have endogenous effects between demand and employment. More labor employed implies more investment by firms. More employment means more wage earnings, so there's more income. And more income means that consumers can spend more money, they can buy more goods, which again is a stimulus to aggregate demand. Plus, more income means more tax payment for the government, so the government also has more money, which in turn can be spent through government expenditures. From this analysis of the macroeconomy from a post-Keynesian perspective follows a policy advice, and that is, during an economic crisis or recession, the demand-side stimulation is much more effective for economic recovery than supply-side policies. Let us now look at an important element in the aggregate demand function, and that is consumption, C. The horizontal axis gives you income and the vertical axis gives you consumption. The curve is downward sloping. In the beginning there's a steep relationship, so at low levels of income, people spend most of that income on consumption. There's little left to save. Even when they have no income, when Y is 0, they still have consumer expenditures. You have to eat to survive. But the more income people have, or the richer a country is, the less they spend on consumer goods, and the more money they keep for savings. So for stimulation of the economy, we need aggregate demand, and hence lots of consumption, because that's an important part of aggregate demand. Now, macroeconomic leakages are uses of income not on consumption. For example, saving money. It's sitting there on a savings account and not spent on goods, hence not creating jobs. Or taxation goes to the government, but it may not spend the money, it may use it to pay off debt. Or consumers buy goods not produced in their own country, not creating jobs in their own country, but imported goods, goods that create jobs elsewhere, but don't do much to stimulate their own economy. So macroeconomic leakages make macroeconomic policies less effective. Post-Keynesian economic policy is concerned with injections into the economy in bad times, and it helped with a multiplier. The multiplier is an accelerator on aggregate demand because it doubles or triples initial spending. How will it do so? Well, it all depends on the total effect on consumption. So here is the equation. A multiplier is the size of an injection, say government expenditures, divided by 1 minus the propensity to consume. Let me give you an example of the multiplier effect. Let's assume that the propensity to consume is 0.6 and that the increase in government expenditures to stimulate the economy is 100 billion yen. Remember, we're in Japan in this chapter. The change in total income will then be that injection of 100 divided by 1 minus the propensity to consume, which was 0.6. So it is 100 divided by 0.4, which is 250 billion yen. In other words, the multiplier is 2.5. The injection initially was 100 billion, but the total effect on the economy, on output, is 250 billion yen. Now suppose that the propensity to consume is smaller, not 0.6 but 0.5. Go through the example yourself and find out what the difference it is for the multiplier. Here is the diagram for the open circular economic flow. In other words, the summary of the post-Keynesian perspective on macroeconomics. What is interesting that we see another sector added. We still have households and the government, firms, also the rest of the world with exports and imports. But we also have now the fire sector. Remember, we introduced the fire sector earlier in the book? Finance, investment, real estate, insurance. So largely the financial sector. The fourth theoretical perspective on macroeconomics is neoclassical economics. And in neoclassical economics, we regard the economy as a closed system. And we look at equilibrium. We consider the economy to be in equilibrium, as aggregate supply is aggregate demand and market clearing, no excess supply and no excess demand. How does this happen? Well, through prices. The general price level, the general wage level, the interest rate in the economy and the exchange rate. For example, S equals I, that is savings equal investments, through the level of R, the interest rate. The level of unemployment is 0 because of a flexible downward wage rate. Wages go down so much until everybody is employed. The neoclassical perspective is summarized in this diagram. It's quite different from the previous diagram, right? Here we have a more normal market picture with a positive sloping aggregate supply curve and a negative sloping aggregate demand curve. But note that now the vertical axis has P, the price level in the economy, and the horizontal axis has Y, the total output. So how does the macroeconomy change in neoclassical economics? It changes as a consequence of shocks. So change is exogenous. It comes from outside. For example, a change in the weather, which reduces the harvest of food. So food prices will go up because food is becoming more scarce. Or political situations, wars, change of governments. These often have effects on levels of investment and share prices. Let me give you an example of macroeconomic change in neoclassical economics through a shock. Let's assume there's a drought, so there's less food, so food prices increase. The rich can still buy the same amount of food, but they have to pay more. The poor buy less, and some even go hungry. Imported food will increase the supply and will dampen the price increase. Governments may subsidize the food for the poor. The total effect on aggregate demand depends on the size of the increases in consumption and in government expenditure, for example on subsidies for the poor, and the size of the increase of imports. Remember, the more imports, the lower the value of aggregate demand, so it has a negative sign. Let me illustrate the example in this diagram. So the original curves of aggregate supply and aggregate demand are the black curves. Now suppose there's less food, so there's less production in the country, meaning that the aggregate supply function shifts upward, more to the left, away from more production. On the x-axis we have y, that's production, so less production, so that's the red curve. But food prices increase, so people will spend more out of their income on food and will have less money on their savings account, meaning that aggregate demand increases a bit, more consumption, less savings. That means that the aggregate demand curve shifts a little bit outward. Not too much, but a little bit outward. That's the change in the aggregate demand curve from the black to the red curve. This leads to a new macroeconomic equilibrium. The old one was the black intersection, Y1, P1, and the new one is the new intersection, Y2 and P2. As you have correctly noted, part of the changes is not just in quantities of food But in price levels, food has become more expensive. So it's not so much that people buy more food, they just pay more for it. That's why we distinguish between nominal prices and real prices. So we have to figure out to what extent the change is simply in prices or also involves real output. The final slide summarizes the neoclassical perspective of a closed systems flow. It's actually a quite hierarchical perspective. At the bottom we have nature. Nature is used as a natural resource by households and firms. We have government with some politics, and which leads to regulation. And on top of all, we have the rest of the world with imports and exports and capital flows.